When most people hear the name Timothy Leary, what comes to mind is the pop caricature of the wild-eyed prophet of LSD, the Pied Piper of the psychedelic 1960s, or perhaps just another casualty of that era's collision between counterculture and repression. But Leary was never just the turn-on, tune-in, drop-out guy. He was something much more subversive. A scientist turned philosopher whose vision kept running long after the Flower Children put down their guitars and the police shut down Haight-Ashbury. He saw through the illusion that history moves in tidy cycles. Leary's mind never left the launch pad. He spent the years after the hippie movement mapping the escape trajectory for the species. To understand why Timothy Leary matters, not just as a cultural artifact, but as a force in the story of human self-transformation, you have to see how he bridged the gap between psychedelic insight and the hardest frontiers of science and technology. Before the world saw him as the high priest of LSD, Leary was a Harvard psychologist, an empiricist in a world that still believed the mind was a closed box. His early research was about the structure and pliability of consciousness, a topic that had been banished from serious science after the behaviorist wave. What made Leary dangerous wasn't just that he advocated for psychedelics. It was that he treated altered states as legitimate tools for exploring and ultimately redesigning the machinery of the self. But where Leary becomes a philosopher of the future is after the collapse of the hippie dream, when he refuses to let the movement's defeat be the end of the story. In the 1970s, with most of his peers retreating into nostalgia or burnout, Leary pivots. He's no longer just talking about consciousness expansion as personal liberation. He's mapping out humanity's evolutionary imperative. And it's here that SMILE emerges. Space migration, intelligence increase, and life extension, fused into a program of self-overcoming that reads in retrospect like a premonition of 21st century transhumanism. Leary saw the post-industrial world for what it was, a machine that fed on conformity and scarcity, grinding down individuality in exchange for comfort and order. He understood that any real liberation, whether personal or collective, would require not just a change of mind, but a change of material conditions, a new architecture for existence. SMILE was his answer. It wasn't a manifesto for escape, but a recipe for transcendence. Leary's call was to move humanity beyond its evolutionary adolescence, to force open the bottlenecks of biology, geography, and time. Let's take this formula apart, piece by piece. Space migration was more than a dream of rockets and flags planted on dead rocks. For Leary, it was the necessary next step for any species that refused extinction. He saw Earth as both cradle and cage. If we lingered too long, the familiar would become fatal. The cosmos, he argued, was not empty, but pregnant with potential homes. Each one a blank page for new societies, new experiments in freedom. He understood that planetary migration would serve not just as a backup plan, but as a multiplier for diversity, creativity, and survival itself. Intelligence increase was not just about better test scores or more efficient algorithms. Leary envisioned a self-directed evolution, humans deliberately augmenting their own minds, using every tool available, from neurochemistry to technology to social experimentation. Intelligence was not static. It was a frontier, a horizon always receding as we advance. For Leary, psychedelics were the first crack in the walls of consciousness, but not the last. He welcomed computers, neural enhancement, and anything that could widen the bandwidth of perception and agency. He saw the mind as the workshop where the next phase of humanity would be forged. Life extension completed the Trinity. If we were going to make the leap to a truly post-Darwinian existence, the arbitrary deadline set by aging and disease had to be lifted. Leary saw death as the last vestige of the old order, a biological tax that kept human aspiration in check. He was one of the first public intellectuals to take the idea of radical longevity seriously, arguing that if we could just engineer consciousness, we could just as well engineer the body. He flirted with cryonics and promoted research into anti-aging decades before Silicon Valley discovered biohacking. But what sets Leary apart, what makes SMI²LE more than a relic of psychedelic excess, is his insistence that these three pillars were inseparable. Space migration without intelligence is just exile. Intelligence without longevity is a tragedy on fast forward. Longevity without new worlds is mere stasis. Each part of the formula amplifies the others. Together they constitute a blueprint for the species' next act, and a permanent rebuke to every apologist for the way things are. Leary's post-hippie work is crucial because it refuses both the nihilism of dystopia and the stagnation of easy comfort. His optimism wasn't naive. It was a wager that the only real sin was to be less than what you could become. He saw the conservative impulse, the drive to freeze history, to limit possibility, as the true enemy, whether it wore the mask of government, repression, or cultural inertia. That's why his message resonated with hackers, cyberpunks, early transhumanists, and visionaries who understood that the future is not inherited, but engineered. In many ways, Leary's vision anticipated and still outpaces mainstream conversations about the future. Today, when you hear talk of Mars colonies, artificial intelligence, and defeating aging, you're hearing the delayed echo of SMI²LE. But where today's technocrats talk in terms of markets and incremental gains, Leary's genius was to keep the focus on human becoming, on the necessity of breaking all limits, not just the profitable ones. For him, the tools were secondary. The point was the refusal to accept boundaries, the obligation to always choose more life, more mind, more possibility. It's easy to dismiss Leary, to reduce him to a footnote in the story of psychedelia or to a symbol of countercultural excess, but that's a mistake. The truth is that almost every debate we're having about the future, automation, genetic engineering, space colonization, the politics of consciousness, takes place on ground he was already exploring decades ago. His most radical insight remains that the only responsible attitude toward the future is to seize it, sculpt it, and refuse to let anyone tell you that you're asking for too much. SMI²LE was never just a slogan. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down at the feet of history. Timothy Leary saw clearer than most that humanity's greatest struggle is not against enemies outside, but against the inertia and entropy within. In the end, his greatest legacy is not what he taught us about LSD or the mind, but what he dared us to imagine for ourselves, that the next step is always out there, waiting to be taken, and that the only real heresy is to stop reaching.